For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this is the Datasense Music Research Network virtual seminars. We are exceptionally delighted to welcome Jeremy Morris from Wisconsin today, and I will hand over to him.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. And thanks for having me. It's great to be here. Thanks, Oded, for helping schedule. And sorry, again, I had to change the time because of a conference I was just in Paris. So I appreciate you guys joining on a different day. And yeah, because I'm just coming back from Paris, my apologies if I'm a little out of sorts. I'm not entirely sure what time or day it is. But yeah, thanks to all of you for being here. I know it's a busy time in this kind of start of summer period, so I appreciate it and appreciate spending some of your time and attention with me. And yeah, I write about the cultural impacts of music technologies and sound media. And I do so largely from a media and cultural studies perspective. And that means I'm primarily coming from a qualitative background. So in other words, I'm not a trained musician, though I have played music, and I'm not a trained computer scientist either, although I do use and play with computers. But coming from the disciplinary background that I do has some advantages, and then I think some disadvantages, and we can talk about those. I guess in the fall, just before COVID hit, I was part of an AI and music series that, or a workshop that was held in Paris. And it was a neat experience because it was, I was funded by the Canadian government, and we ended up bringing kind of musicians there, people who work in music departments at universities, communications and media studies scholars, computer scientists, music industry workers. So it was a kind of a neat group of people, but we learned pretty quickly, the different perspectives that everybody brings to the problem means that you think about how you solve things differently. So yeah, some of my early work focused on music and the transition from music on CDs to music as a digital file on computers. And I was really interested in the technologies that helped kind of make music in physical formats, how to make it accessible and usable as digital formats. I was interested in what it took to convince users and musicians that music files downloaded or streamed to their devices could be a complement or a supplement to the music that they used in physical formats. And I think, a lot of the writing on digital music at that time, this is kind of in the early mid 2000s to 2010s kind of thing. A lot of the writing at the time was focused on the kind of immaterial nature of digital music. And I was interested in the interfaces and the devices and the software that helped make music feel material in various ways on computers. So I looked at programs like Winamp, iTunes, Napster, some of the interfaces of digital music then, as well as some of the infrastructural companies involved. So I did some work on a company called the CD Database, or it's now Gracenote. It provides a lot of metadata for digital music. And I sort of analyzed how those tools were shaping contemporary music distribution. More recently, I've been studying podcasting and software, mobile apps, and I've updated some of my older work to think about streaming. And I think if there's a through line in all of it, it's a profound interest in the digitization of cultural goods and experiences, and how digital formats of the media we love shape the distribution, discovery, and experience of things like music, sound, and software. So I'm going to focus mostly today on music, but I'm happy to talk about any of this other stuff in the chat, in the Q&A afterwards. All right, so I'll just do a quick check-in there. Was everybody able to hear me okay on that? Was my microphone cutting out or anything like that?
I think everything was fine.
Okay, great. Well, then I'm going to just get my timer going here so that I stay relatively on track. All right, and then I'm going to share my screen here too. The first little part of my talk here, I usually do see, let's just make sure. I usually do it. I usually play some music in the background while I talk, but I've discovered that Zoom doesn't allow me to do that. So I think what I'll do is I'll just play some of the music that I was going to play, just so you can have it kind of in your head. It's just an instrumental piano track, but you can just kind of imagine that in your head as I do this. So the talk's going to be in 4 parts today, and this first part is kind of like a long-winded intro about how I ended up studying what I was studying here. But I'll just give you a quick little sample of this music track here. So I didn't mean to study technology. After I left a job in advertising in the early 2000s, I was curious to study music and how the logics of advertising and branding were affecting musicians. It felt like a lot of bands that I was interested in were starting to act more like brands, even independent musicians that I had assumed were maybe further away from corporate music life. And while the assertion that bands were like brands seems pretty commonplace now, it felt novel to me at the time. The point is, I was interested in music, not technology. I cared about the meaning that we make and take from the right song, the right artist at the right time in our lives, and the ways that we use music to build and understand ourselves and the world around us. I cared about musicians, about the creative and weird people who pick up instruments and understand that sometimes sounds express ideas and emotions that words on their own can't. I cared about music listeners, about individuals who discover and incorporate music into their everyday lives in countless surprising, touching, but also entirely mundane ways, from playing songs on a commute to singing a lullaby to a child. But as I was writing about music and musicians and how they were using digital technology, it became clear that I was writing, about the things that I cared about, involved writing about technology and how it's shaping the ways that musicians make and connect with listeners, the ways listeners discover and connect with artists and songs, and what listeners could do with that song or that album once it was downloaded or streamed to their various devices. The digital music commodity seemed to offer new forms of control for various actors in the music industry, even though there was all these promises of disruption and how digital music was changing the music industry entirely. But it was also undeniable that digital technologies had afforded listeners and artists new possibilities for exploring, interacting with, and sharing music. And I became particularly interested in the rise of music streaming platforms like Spotify and the technologies that underpin the streaming era, like recommendation engines, metadata databases, personalization algorithms, and AI, artificial intelligence. Often cloaked in the language of innovation or progress, technologies like algorithms and artificial intelligence are technical black boxes made to stand in for all kinds of social and cultural human decisions. When it's convenient for the engineers who build them or the companies who deploy them, these technologies are nothing more than simple equations or coded instructions. But more often than not, the use of algorithms, AI, recommendations, and other such technologies represent a series of complex cultural judgments that software engineers and computer coders make about how to properly represent people and their identities, how to make decisions about what's right and what's wrong, or how to tell what's funny or not. This was, I think, somebody who programmed a neural network to invent new jokes. So you can see some of the enjoyable jokes that come out of AI. Or about what constitutes a hit song or a hit film. But these edge case scenarios for controversial or novel uses of artificial intelligence or personalization algorithms belie the more everyday uses to which many of these technologies are already being put. As music streaming services invest in new technologies to help you figure out what to listen to next, or what to listen to where and when, they also make decisions about what content stays or goes, about what practices are or aren't allowed, about what content gets discovered or hidden, valued or devalued. These systems also make decisions about the very pathways guiding how cultural content circulates on and through contemporary digital platforms. In other words, decisions that platforms make affect who gets seen, heard, and amplified by the discovery mechanisms, and who gets buried in a sea of content. So that's a long-winded intro, kind of way to say that I'm particularly interested in how, as platforms design and deploy technologies to reinforce their business needs, content producers, end users, and other stakeholders find novel ways to work within, around, and even against the technical decisions that these platforms impose. And I've been exploring the ways that various stakeholders work to optimize cultural goods and services for digital platforms, whether it's musicians tailoring songs to be playlist friendly, marketing companies artificially boosting downloads, or artists stuffing song titles with keywords. I argue that there are some platform effects that put new pressures on creative laborers to manipulate digital platforms for economic or cultural gains. I also explore what this drive to optimize culture means for digital content creators more generally, and for the very songs and sounds that they circulate. So today in the talk, I'm going to focus on three kinds of optimization that I've been trying to work into a kind of bigger idea. So I'm going to look at sonic optimization, data optimization, and infrastructural optimization. And hopefully in doing this, we'll see that how, when we look at how music is optimized for platforms, we also see the tensions and pressures that it introduces for users, artists, and for platform providers. All right, does that all make sense there so far? We'll get into the specifics now of those different kinds of optimization that I was talking about. Oh, and I meant to say at the start, I don't have my chat window open. So if anybody wants to jump in and ask anything, feel free to just jump off the mic or raise your hand or something like that, and I'll see it in the window here. Okay. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about fake artists and this idea of sonic optimization. So that song that I played off the top was a song by an artist named Anna Olgika. Who's an artist who has over 1.5 million monthly listeners and who has songs have been played close to 100 million times. She's not the only other artist like this. There are similar statistics for artists like Lo Mimi Mieux, Charlie Key, Karen Borg, Charles Bolt, and my personal favorite name, Figgy Malone. Despite these numbers, it's unlikely you know these artists by their names, but you might have heard one of their songs if you're one of the millions of users that have listened to some of the curated playlists that Spotify has, such as the ones you see on the screen here. Piano in the background, or music for concentration, piano and chill, and the like. You may also know of those artists' names because that artist and Anna Olgika and dozens of others like Anna generated some press in 2016, 2017 as investigative reporters and reports surfaced about the presence of fake artists on Spotify. These were artists that seemed to have no presence outside of Spotify's ecosystem. They had no website, no public profile, no live performances. Like there was no evidence that they were real people. They seemed to exist solely as musical fodder to fill out some of these Spotify mood-based playlists. Critics were really worried about this, and in particular worried that Spotify was hiring or commissioning these artists directly, thereby allowing the streaming service to save money instead of paying, the steep licensing fees that they normally pay labels. But there was worry that Spotify was somehow, putting these placements above other artists, and as a result, royalties were getting directed back to Spotify rather than to musicians. Spotify, for its part, responded to the controversy by saying, we do not and have not ever created fake artists and put them on Spotify playlists. Categorically untrue, full stop. Now, after looking into it more, most of the artists under investigation, it turns out were actually real people, though many of the artists were simply aliases of a handful of actual musicians or companies that excelled in creating this kind of low-key, atmospheric, piano chill music that seemed perfectly tailored and designed and optimized to fit within Spotify's various mood-based playlists. These artists understood the platform on which they were distributing music relied less on traditional genre or artist persona as drivers for musical popularity and more on mood, tone, and listening occasion. So they created their music accordingly. Journalists took to calling this kind of music Spotify core or stream bait to indicate a kind of connection between musical genre and the technologies that deliver the music. And then this whole debate ensued about what was Spotify core. And the terms seemed to be like the only commonality in critics who were using that term seemed to be that it was shorthand for music that sounds like it's tailored to streaming. But there was a lot of confusion about what actually constituted Spotify core. Was it that kind of piano stuff that I explained, or was it something even different? So this is one producer describing what Spotify core sounds like. It has this soft, emo-y, cutesy thing to it, really minimal, based on just a few sample elements, often a snap in the verses and then the choruses, right? So we see here a pretty vague description that could apply to a lot of things. But Spotify core and stream bait, regardless of like what kind of music it was trying to describe, was meant to be derisive, right? In the sense that if the music wasn't directly created by algorithms or by data-driven decisions, it sounds like it could have been. So the fake artists in question that that Spotify was talking about in the Anna Olgica case, those were actual musicians using pseudonyms, but other artists got caught up in this kind of controversy. Justin Bieber, Lana Del Rey, the Chainsmokers, so mostly US and Canadian bands there, but Muse as well for a UK example. These were all sort of being lumped in as examples of bands that were kind of writing music in particular ways to stand out on streaming services. Now, the fake artist controversy has since died down, but the issues that animated it remain open questions, right? What counts as a legitimate artist on digital cultural platforms, and who gets to decide? How do some artists adjust their sound to be heard and amplified by the discovery mechanisms on the platform, while others get buried or crowded out in a sea of content? In other words, how do artists optimize their sound to stand out? Now, the press was primarily interested in the first question there, right? Is whether or not artists that aren't situated in a kind of authentic musical scene should still be on the same platform as more traditional musicians. But the second and third question are the ones that I think are more interesting for media studies scholars, since they get at how artists are making adjustments to their sounds and practices in response to new platform demands. Now, before I go any further, I just want to back up and talk a little bit about platformization and this idea of platform effects. I don't know if these are specific to media studies or if you come across them in the disciplines that you all work in. But as I noted in the intro, digital platforms now have a significant influence in shaping the content that users discover through algorithmic recommendations, human curated or edited suggestions, or more passive forms of content presentation like interface organization and navigation. I talk mainly about music, but we can think about how this applies to app stores, podcasting platforms, video platforms, and the like. The circulation of music and other digital cultural goods exists now as part of a complex set of platforms that aim to provide a stack-like environment that combines production, promotion, and circulation and use of cultural commodities all in one service. So, if before you had a product that was produced at a factory and then shipped to a retail store and then sold at a retail store and then used by the consumer in their home. Right now, all of that process happens through one kind of digital store that is on the exact same device that you're using. So whether we call it the platformization of cultural production or platform capitalism, platforms work in ways that make content that resides on them contingent. And I mean that in the sense of both being like modular and constantly altered. So, content that appears on platforms is always sort of dependent on the platforms. But I also mean it in the sense of cultural content is now precarious to the changing rules and policies of the platforms. So producers of cultural goods, in other words, kind of work to adapt their content aesthetically and economically to match the ways that platforms work. Now, this isn't necessarily new. Cultural creators are dependent on and their products contingent on the aims, goals, and features of the platform. Physical retail environment has long dictated the ways in which products could and would appear in stores. And I have, a picture of a newsstand here. You can think about how newspaper publishers designed headline banners to stand out in vendor stands, or how Walmart's strong arm pricing policies and display policies have shaped how how product manufacturers approach their business, right? Like for musicians and labels, they'd have to often consider whether to include offensive content on their albums or not, since stores like Walmart have historically had policies against stocking CDs with parental advisory warning stickers. So platforms are a kind of digital evolution of these physical retail affordances, one where the display, discovery, search, and consumption of a cultural good all take place through a software search bar and digital database rather than at multiple points in the distribution chain. I like to think of the various responses to these new conditions of contingency as examples of what we might call platform effects. And this draws on a term by a media studies scholar, Mark Katz, and he uses the term phonograph effects. And he was using that to describe the ways that musicians at the dawn of recording altered their style of play, to better be captured by then new studio recording equipment, right? So he talks about violinists and their increased use of vibrato, or vocalists using close miking, singing techniques so that they could be better captured by microphones. We can also hear echoes of the concept of phonograph effects when we hear people talking about how now on streaming services, because people start at the beginning of the song rather than on the radio where you might turn on a song in the middle of it, how the first 30 seconds of a song are incredibly important to kind of catch and hook listeners. So there's been all this like effort to revising what the first 30 seconds of a song sounds like. Leslie Mayer's work about how musicians are increasingly orienting their music in sync-friendly ways for TV shows and ads by making the songs kind of fit certain moods or have certain lyrics in them. These are all examples of kind of what Katz might call phonograph effects. And so, we can see that, while I'm calling it platform effects, musicians are, perhaps as they've always done, kind of adjusting their practices to the platforms and environments in which their music appears, circulates, and plays. They're learning the rules of digital music distribution, and they're trying to optimize their content for the platforms on which they appear. So platform effects and the optimization that artists do in response to them are by no means new. It might seem to you weird to use the language of optimization here, since it is in the same vein of what musicians have been doing throughout time, but that's kind of why I like to connect it with phonograph effects to sort of trace that history. But I also want to use optimization because it points us to a time when it seemed easier to separate music and musical culture from the deluge of data and information that we now call content, right? I think platform effects point us to the fact that music is now digital and as a result can be searched for in all these new ways. Okay, so back to the fake artists here then, after that little side tangent. One of the platforms that we can observe, thanks to the fake artist controversy, is this idea of sonic optimization. This is a kind of optimization that involves tactics of retuning the sonic features of a song, album, or playlist to meet the perceived affordances of a platform. Given that Spotify relies heavily on algorithmic technologies to automate the analysis of musical similarities and to group them into playlists, these artists were crafting sonic content that could be algorithmically discoverable, even though it was sonically, maybe sonically unremarkable, or at least meant to be sort of not standing out. The optimization in this case is taking place at the level of the sound itself. Given that sounds are more subjective and less easy to quantify, as the debates over the Spotify core suggest, the optimization is subtle enough that it not only persists on the platform, but thrives through the inclusion on playlists and recommendations. And my colleague Rob Prey has done a lot of neat work in this area about how artists are increasingly orienting their music, making strategies towards sounds that they think will succeed on the platform, and in particular sounds that will be included on some of Spotify's biggest playlists, right? For Spotify, playlists occupy a central role in Spotify's strategy for attracting advertisers. So getting an artist placed on one of these playlists can have a significant effect on an artist's career and popularity. Artists are increasingly aware of the curatorial power that Spotify exerts, and they can then make decisions about what sounds they think will succeed. All right, so that's sonic optimization. Hopefully that all makes sense. Everything sounding okay where all of you are?
Yeah.
All right, I'll move into part 3 here, which is about cloners and spammers, or what we might call data optimization. So the altering of sonic characteristics to match some idea of Spotify core is just one example of a platform effect. But we can see other ways in which artists adjust their content to stand out. And this is what I've called data optimization. And I'll talk about a couple of examples here, specifically cloning and spamming, which involves borrowing tactics from search engine optimization and applying them to music platforms to increase discoverability. So in these cases, you'll see an artist and they'll change their name or the profile of their songs to match popular search terms, such as like calling your band name, the name of another popular album or something like that. So you can take a look. In this case, I've Carly Rae Jepsen here, who's a Canadian artist who had a hit song in 2012 called Call Me Maybe. But if you look in the artist category, you can see that there's an artist named Here's My Number, so Call Me Maybe, which is a lyric from the song. There's an artist named Call Me Maybe. There's an artist named Maybe You Call Me. So you see all these people trying to name different parts of their artist profile around another popular artist. And cloners are hard to track. They spring up really quickly and they're often removed just as quickly. Although I took this screenshot last week and this hit was in 2012, so they still persist for quite a while. And the cloners do tend to act quickly though. Kendrick Lamar just had a new album released last week, and it was called Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers. And there's already folks who've got their kind of work out there cloned. So you see, an artist here, Grizzy Hendrix, who's got the name of his album as the same as Kendrick's album. You see this other artist, Digital, I think is how you pronounce that, who's also sort of taken that name as the title of his EP. So that when you search for the name, Mr. Morale, like I did up there, right, it'll pull up all these other kind of artists who are not Kendrick Lamar. It looks like Digital here is an actual artist who's got his own songs and just wanted you to hear them. But there are other imitations out there where people just do knockoffs of popular songs, instrumental versions of pop songs, or they just do brief songs of white noise or silence or a commercial for something else. Many of these clones are not properly licensed, so they generate royalties for the cloner and not for the cloned. Now, this kind of data optimization is perhaps the most unsurprising of the three that I'm talking about today, I think, just because we're so used to hearing about search engine optimization now that we're however many years into Google. With music turned into computational data, it's hardly surprising that the ways that various actors have learned to deconstruct search algorithms and then, game them is sort of being used in the realm of music as well. And this kind of optimization also has previous histories in other media practices, right? The practice of sending press releases to news organizations or crafting sound bites in an easy to quote format for journalists. These are kind of precursors to modern day optimization efforts. But it involves making content algorithmically recognizable, usually by altering the metadata of the digital cultural good in question. Optimization can seem harmless enough. Maybe it makes content more efficient to find, more visible, more streamlined, more ready for use. But it also presents highly curated and strategic efforts to reconfigure search results as somehow organic or natural, right? Making it a practice that many critics have described as kind of shadowy or duplicitous. Because being discoverable or appearing in search results matters, as Tarleton Gillespie notes, those interested in having their information selected as relevant will tend to orient themselves towards these algorithmic systems to make themselves algorithmically recognizable in the hopes of being amplified by them. There's a number of scholars working on this kind of idea. Tana Bucher calls it the pursuit of visibility. Kelly Cotter calls it playing the visibility game. And Anne Helmand calls it being platform ready. But regardless of the term, users are using their kind of acquired knowledge, resources about the myths about how algorithms work to sort of help manipulate their content in such a way that is rewarded with greater visibility. And so in using the term optimization here, I'm hoping to emphasize that it's not just a question of being seen or heard on specific platforms, but it's also a question about the nature of cultural experiences, right? When there's a deliberate kind of changing of the content to make it stand out. Musicians and other platform stakeholders are increasingly facing pressures to act as software developers, as visibility engineers, on top of their roles as musicians and sound creators. Musicians and producers shift, as Keith Negus writes, from creator of a product to curator of content. There's a fine and blurry line, though, between making oneself or one's content algorithmically recognizable and optimization that goes too far or that goes against the platform's policies. Often dismissed as spamming, gaming, faking, these practices are regularly seen as threats or unwelcome, or as Finn Brunton so aptly puts it, like unexpectedly blowing a vuvuzela in the middle of a conversation. But spam and optimization often work on the same spectrum. They're both about turning technological systems inward on themselves. The line between spam and optimization is a shadowy boundary that gets drawn around what is acceptable and what isn't, right? So we can think about like targeted advertising versus Google bombing. These are the same kinds of practices, but one of them is sort of allowed and one of them is not. So this provokes a larger cultural debate about distinguishing acceptable practices from unacceptable ones on platforms, right? About distinguishing spam from optimized, and more importantly, about who has the power to make that decision. As Tarleton Gillespie argues, spam is whatever is defined away as illegitimate by the mechanisms designed to do so. So let's take a look at a couple of other artists here who engage in other forms of metadata optimization, just to show you the kind of boundary cases that we're talking about here. Knowing that the limit of songs per album that Spotify allows is 100, some artists stuff their albums with dozens of songs with different titles. even if their songs are sonically identical. So one of the most famous cases is this guy, Sirwan Mutant, who, for example, gave one of their tracks 9 different names on the same album. And my examination of Mutant's discography reveals over 68 albums released in a 5-year period from 2005 to 2010, with 50 of those released in 2010 alone. We can also think about the proliferation of, oh, and yeah, this is a look at some of his albums. I guess one of his albums called Elixir of Chaos, which, you know, has 50 tracks on it, all kind of in varying length. We can also think about some of the happy birthday metadata songs that are now in there, right? So you can literally find a birthday song for every one of your, every possible name out there. Another notorious musical overproducer is a guy named Matt Farley, who's released over 14,000 short improvised songs under 60 different aliases. And each song title is usually named after popular search terms. So this is just one album of his. And again, he takes different names for each album, but this one he was calling himself Paparazzi and the Photogs. But you can see here in the search results of the song titles, right? There's names of a whole bunch of famous people, so that anybody who's searching for anybody famous may stumble on one of his songs. Now, Farley's noted that in interviews, his songs really aren't that much fun to record, but they're the kind of thing that are most likely to bring in the bucks, since albums cost around $50 to make, but they bring in thousands of dollars a year for them. Now, we can argue about the musical or the satirical value of these efforts, but these are artists that are optimizing their songs for maximum discovery or revenue through a barrage of keywords, duplicate audio, or other techniques that capitalize on platform metadata and how search engines work. And we can see in the response to these various artists that there's often a kind of double standard that emerges, as Caitlin Petrie and Brooke Duffy note, where tactics that are valorized as innovative when practiced by the platforms are portrayed as unduly manipulative or even corrupt when deployed by cultural producers. So whereas the fake artist controversy, Spotify stood behind the artists because it was beneficial to them to have those artists there, that wasn't necessarily the case with Mutant or with Matt Farley's work here. This is why controversies like fake artists on Spotify or other similar incidents represent interesting limit cases. They're small breaches in the boundaries that platform providers have established. They're proof that technical systems, stakeholders, and users are in this dynamic and ever-shifting socio-technical relationship. Farley and Mutant, for example, do make original creations, and they are real people, even if they subvert the expectations of what traditional songs look like. Spotify and other platforms still do provide access to their music, but they've both been kind of reprimanded and told ways in which they can and cannot be allowed to add music to their service. So Farley has been told by Apple Music, for example, that there are certain conditions that his songs must meet and certain lines he can't cross if he wants to continue uploading. But it's clear that these artists have tried to optimize their discographies for maximum discovery and profit using metadata, whether through a barrage of keywords, the use of trending songs and artist names, or renaming the same songs. Each of these tracks has specifically and specially been crafted so that its metadata helps it stick out on the platform. Whoops, I think I have 2 part 3s in this talk. I guess this should probably be part 4 at this point. So yes, don't worry, we're still making progress. This is the section on gaming the system or infrastructural optimization. So in addition to altering the sonic content or experimenting with metadata, optimization can also take place at the infrastructural level. This type of optimization refers to processes of exploiting the ways that platforms work at their most kind of fundamental level to increase the visibility of a certain song or artist. So this might involve some sonic optimization, and it might involve some metadata optimization as well. But in these cases, actors are really looking to optimize performance of particular songs by gaming the platform through its very infrastructure. And oftentimes this is done by boosting the play counts of an album, of a song or an artist, or by employing bots or manipulating royalty payouts. And there are specialized organized click services that are readily available. I studied a company called Streamify, which is now out of business, but there are sites like Fiverr, Mechanical Turk, or this article that was just out a few days ago has 16 more bots that you can use for kind of programming Spotify. And so, yeah, artists will enter into a relationship with these companies in order to kind of boost their play counts. A very early example of this was in 2013, where a security analyst and computer scientist, Peter Fillmore, showed how easy it was to fool Spotify's royalty program by creating 3 bots to simulate 3 listeners listening to his songs 24 hours a day for a whole month. But after he sort of released data on how he did this, a whole bunch of other cases of click fraud followed. More playful cases have emerged as well. One band that I've studied is a great example of that. It's a band called Wolfpack, and they released this album called Sleepify, which you picture here. It was a collection of 10 songs. Each one was ranging between 30 and 33 seconds in length, kind of thing. But the tracks were just complete silence. So that's why you see their track list is on the album here. That's why the first song was called Z. The second song was called ZZZ. So it was meant to be, quiet album, let's just say. And the length of songs was specifically chosen because this is how long, 30 seconds is how long it takes before Spotify considers a song officially played. And so this is when it starts generating royalties for the band. And so what the band did was they implored fans to stream the album on repeat for the entire evening while they slept. So this is why it was called Sleepify. They wanted you to play it for the 8-9 hours that you might be sleeping in a night. And they asked all their fans to just do this repeatedly as much as they could. They ended up netting $20,000 in royalties before Spotify realized what was going on and removed them from the platform. In a similarly playful but more scholarly vein, there's a team of media studies researchers in Sweden who've written this book. It's fantastic. I don't know if you've read it, Spotify Teardown. But they've sort of been probing the limits of Spotify as well by creating fake albums, by creating listening bots, by doing all sorts of things that sort of push against the platform's expected use. And so it's full of these examples of how blurry the lines are between legitimate practices and unsanctioned machinic practices. And at some point in the book, they ask this great question, right, which is what happens when, not if, streaming bots approximate human listener behavior such that it becomes impossible to distinguish between a human and a machine. Now, Spotify does react, and it removes some of the more flagrant violations on its platforms, including sending a cease and desist letter to the Spotify Teardown team. But the rationales they provide for doing so often hint at the judgment calls that are having to go on here. So this email that you see here is an email from an artist who had songs up on Spotify. They're getting a kind of takedown notice not from Spotify directly, but from a company that works to place artists on Spotify. And he was purposely trying to game Spotify's royalty payout scheme by continually playing his own music for long periods of time. But he received this notice, right, which just says, Spotify removed your song due to possible streaming infringement. This happened because it was streamed a massive number of times by a tiny number of people. Real people don't listen to the same exact song thousands of times in a row. So it looks to Spotify like you were trying to trick them, right? And I think the invocation of real people is interesting here, right? Because it's kind of ironic. The user in question was indeed a real person rather than a bot, even though they were listening slightly unrealistically. But in its effort to stamp out these frauds and bots, Spotify's policies also starts to shape what counts as real listening or real listeners. right? They kept the fake artists on their system from the earlier controversy because they were real musicians, even if they were producing music in a way that might seem algorithmic. But they cracked down on real listeners because their behaviors seem unrealistic. So the line platform providers must draw then is both a conceptual one about what counts as acceptable or not, but it's also a self-interested strategic one about what data is being generated by the presence of certain content on their platforms and how valuable that data is. Spotify uses the language of optimization when explaining its decisions too. So from a press release that Spotify did, they say, another reason that decreasing spam matters to us is that our systems are always optimized for real world music. But in optimizing their systems for real world music, they're also making decisions about what constitutes real content and real listening practices. For many of the producers and artists making music in what they might call the real world, these tactics that Spotify deems as illegitimate are simply efforts to optimize content in order to succeed on Spotify's platforms. You know, they might argue that they're just trying to do the very thing that Spotify was built to do, connect artists with a global audience of listeners in an attempt to monetize a massive network of music listening activities. So this is kind of what's at stake, I think, in the debates over optimization then. They're ultimately about politics that curtail, stamp out, or amplify certain kinds of listening, and thus certain modes of interacting with music. All right, let's get to the end here. This is the conclusion. So yeah, with all these examples in mind, I'm going to move towards a conclusion. These strategies and tactics and examples of platform effects are part of what I call the optimization of culture, which is the strategic preparation and readying of cultural goods to orient them towards and ready them for circulation, discovery, and use on particular platforms. And it's not just music. I think you can see this in apps and in podcasting, as I've done research on these as well. Instagram influencers who create reciprocal pods to kind of boost their content. There's a growing assemblage of organizations and individuals across the cultural industries who find ways to manipulate digital platforms for economic and cultural gains. As these platforms become kind of central means of distribution, content producers, marketers, users, platforms themselves all engage in creative and sometimes unsanctioned practices in order to take advantage of platform affordances, whether that be for making content more visible or for realizing greater profits. While many of these optimization tactics are often considered illegitimate uses of the platform, the blurry lines they create point to the tensions and the competing needs that we see between what happens when you create a platform where, like, users, musicians, marketers, everybody's kind of on that same space. Rather than simply interesting side notes, then I hope these examples and these conflicts over optimization that I've talked about have much to tell us about the way platformization shapes cultural production. Platform effects are both a symptom of the problem of platformization and a response to it. There's an oversupply of content because these platforms promise to allow almost anyone to share their content there. And so technologies are needed to help surface the most relevant content and give a particular search result. There's incentives then to reverse engineer these platforms and to try and optimize content for them, since that will help users win at the visibility game. It's also because I think on a lot of these platforms, the more organic ways of getting featured, right? Like how you become like a featured artist on Spotify, or how you get prominent space in the interface is pretty opaque, right? So creators resort to these tactics that help them stand out in other ways. And despite the highly visible pushback against some forms of optimization, despite Spotify taking down content, platforms actually benefit from a greater amount of content options on their services, whether those options are real, fake, or cloned. While they don't want their stores or streaming services to be full or overrun with malicious content or material that would make users distrust the platform, The very economics of streaming means that the more things that people have to play, the better it is for the services, right? Since each download, listen, play, skip generates some kind of data for the platform. The legitimacy or authenticity of any given optimization practice depends on the vantage point from which you approach it, right? Wolfpack's album of silent songs may look like spam to Spotify, but to the band and its fans, it's part of a business model that they are pursuing to support their efforts to make sustainable wage as musicians in an era where they receive fractions of a cent per stream. Peter Fillmore, the security analyst who tried to game Spotify's royalty payout system, said in an interview, you know, if you're doing it wrong if you want to make money in music by being a musician, right? So there's sort of this sense that it's always got to be a little bit more than just the content that you're making. Computer scientists often discuss the quality of an algorithm and employ this to talk about like the technical quality of it, right? Does it return the right search output when you've given it a certain input? But I think it'd be interesting to think of the term quality and how we might imply it to think of other kinds of quality, right? User-centric models of quality might emphasize results that deliver fast and enjoyable searches that fit within a user's listening profile, and that strike the right balance of exposure to new and familiar artists, or that properly reflect contextual listening factors. Artist-centric models of quality might emphasize transparency in terms of how an artist and their cultural influences are presented and represented by a particular platform's interface. We can even think bigger than just, about individual artists or individual users and think publicly, right? What if we thought about a culture-centric model of quality that would push users away from filter bubbles of tastes and would instead contribute to supporting and fostering local music scenes, strengthening bonds within and between various musical communities, or that favored social connection around music and the arts in all their true cultural diversity? So, I think I'll just end there by saying, like, when we're asking about optimization, right? The question is not just like, what are we trying to optimize, but who are we optimizing for, especially as we go on to build the next generation of music platforms. All right, sorry, I ran a couple minutes long there. I hope that's okay, but thanks for your attention, and I'll stop sharing my screen here.
That was great. Do we have any questions from anyone, either in the chat or in the actual Audible? Maybe until someone comes up, it's a kind of speculative question that I don't know if, okay. How about Nicola? You have a question.
Hi, yeah, thanks so much. That was really, really great talk, really enjoyed it. Just a historical question really, which was, when did culture become content? So from a sort of historical perspective, is there a particular moment that you think's, or moments in time when there was some kind of shift or amplification and so on?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have maybe no firm answer, but I do have a grad student who was doing a thesis on the word content and like when the word content starts to take off. And I think in terms of the way that I'm using it, it certainly feels like it's around the beginning of the 2000s and like the takeoff of Web 2.0, like content and content creator really becomes this discourse of, where everything that ends up on the web is now no longer distinct. Like you're writing a blog, you're making music, you're doing video, you just, everybody becomes a kind of content creator. And I think because that term, has a specific use in like web design when people were designing like content management systems, right? So I think a lot of the tools and technologies that those sites were built on just made it almost easier to talk about those things as one big word, which is content. But yeah, I think that's a super interesting part of it, right? Is should, you know, music be treated and thought about in the exact same way as a video producer, as like your post on a blog somewhere, right? Like, to me, those are different enough forms of like artistic practice and like form that I think it reduces it to refer to it as content. But it's certainly like the way that these platforms think about the stuff that's on there, right? And especially Spotify, you know, they're really making a move on all kinds of audio content now, right? It's not just a music place anymore. Your podcasts are there. They want to get into audiobooks, right? Like it benefits the platforms to not be a music platform, to be a content platform. But yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, because where I've been thinking about it before was in relation to hardware, you know, in the way, if we look back in history at the kind of join up between hardware companies, music tech companies, and the idea of companies selling devices. And again, going back to your point then about the multiplicity of content, it doesn't really matter what the content is, as long as it displays the device. So that whole thing about the iPhone or the iPad and kind of what kind of content was used to sell it to people.
Right.
And the same debates are going on now, aren't they, with AR and VR, which is all this stuff about we don't have good enough content yet to get people to buy the devices. So yeah, really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, no, and you make a great point too there about the different interests of those companies involved, right? Like Apple as a device company is in a very different position than Spotify as a kind of like content distributor company, right? And then you have these hybrids, right, of like Google, where, you know, they're trying to push as hard on their devices as on their content. So so yeah, that really shapes to how the service ends up looking, right? Which is, are you building an iPod so that you can just have as much, you don't care where the stuff comes from or who's buying the stuff from wherever, as long as they're paying for that device, versus the Spotify problem, which is how do we get people to listen to as much of our content as possible, stay on our site as long as possible. Thanks, Steve.
Federico, you have a question.
Yes. Hi, Jeremy. Thank you. That was a really interesting presentation. My question is around audio features, because, you know, Spotify's algorithm, you know, has all of these audio features, and you know, it has certain features like danceability, right, or energy, or I think it has quite a few. I cannot remember all of them at the moment, but I wonder if you know of any kind of like artists that are using those particular features to optimize their music, for example, for particular searches and things like this.
Yeah, no, that's great. And yes, Spotify does have, like, that company, they took over the Echo Nest, which I've done a bit of like study on, was like the main source of their data. These guys basically had like broken out songs into all the different things that you're saying, you know, beats per minute. But yeah, then they turn it into these more cultural characteristics, like beats per minute then somehow becomes danceability, right? And working that way. I don't have, other than Rob Prey's work about like people trying to craft their songs to be on certain playlists. I don't have people or evidence of people saying like, oh yeah, there's this thing that I think is a category that Spotify is using, and therefore I should, you know, make it at 105 BPM or 135 BPM. You know what I mean? Like, I haven't seen a direct correlation in that way. And I think part of it is because, like, I don't know how much musicians, maybe I would find it more with like the people who are advertisers or who are like specifically trying to place songs. But you have this thing, right, where like artists, I don't think like talking about necessarily like wanting to say like, I'm writing my song based on this set of criteria that's here, right? Like, it's, there's sort of a pushback to like, I don't necessarily want to be that. So yeah, the short answer is no. And then the follow-up is I would love to hear more about that from artists, in the sense that, like, yeah, do they factor in any of these things? And part of it's that tricky part where, like, they maybe have a sense that this is how the algorithm works, or this is how Spotify will surface something, but it's so hard to know because Spotify's not really transparent about it, right? So, you know, it's hard to necessarily know that, like, oh, this is the criteria that I need to be writing towards. Sorry,
Yes,
not a,
yeah,
not
yeah, no, no, no. It
answer.
makes a lot of sense what you're saying, and yeah, you know, obviously, musicians would have to be really aware of first what these features are, and then how to somehow approximate them. But I could imagine if there were some artists with that kind of know-how, that they might, for example, you know, try to emulate, you know, let's say a track that is very popular by kind of like, you know, sort of approximating to some of its kind of sonic features, and then, you know, to that would play well in terms of recommendations, I would imagine.
Yeah, and I think you do get some of that. Like, I've read cases where, you know, because that first 30 seconds of a song is really important. One of the ways to, like, hook people is to have, like, kind of a weird modulated voice, like either auto-tuned or some kind of computerized voice in that. So you'll hear, you know, a series of songs where, like, in the first 30 seconds, there's some kind of vocal hook that is that. But that's probably the closest that I know of something that specific. But yeah, that's a great question.
Any other questions from anyone? Maybe I'll ask my kind of final question. It is speculative. This kind of, let's call it kind of warfare between the platforms and the artists about optimization. Do you have a guess whether this is mainly just because the technology is very new and everybody's still finding out how things work, and we're kind of, in a sense, we are measuring non-musical things, and to what extent do you maybe foresee that it will mature to a way where you know, the marketplace is more knowable and transparent in a way that the expectations of artists and listeners, there isn't that all this strange intermediary that is untransparent and kind of opaque, and you need to optimize so carefully.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely an element of the newness to it, in the sense that, like, I don't think the platform, like Spotify, doesn't yet know all the ways that people are figuring out how to be creative and messing with the system, right? So, like, it's always this kind of game of cat and mouse where Spotify seems to, like, hear about a practice that's happening and then tries to put in some kind of policy to, like, allow it or not allow it. But of course, as soon as those things get out, everybody starts doing them, and then they start being less effective, right? So this, you'd see this with, I guess I've seen this with podcasts and with, yeah, mostly with podcasts. So with podcasts, there's a metadata field that you can enter in keywords for your podcast. And that was at one point really heavily used in ranking whether or not a podcast would, you know, search. So if you look for the word shoes or something, whatever, the famous shoe podcast would come up first because it had keywords, you know, shoes. But people were stuffing so many keywords in there that Apple was like, no, we're not going to use this anymore. So they still have a keyword field, but they don't use it as part of their weighting it when they're designing their algorithms. So, you know, I think you see these platform providers react to try and figure out, like, as they tweak them, okay, what's going to give what we think is the most useful and the best search result, right? But I think you're always going to have artists kind of like plugging away, and certainly marketing companies are savvy enough. There's this whole like secondary industry now of, at least with apps, they have app store optimization. Like there's companies that you can literally employ to help you figure out how to make the thumbnail stand out because it's the right color or whatever. I'm sure there's a similar kind of music store optimization network of companies, right? That just kind of invest in that. So as a result, I think you're always having these companies figure out, like being able to say like, okay, now we know the way to stand out. You know, it's like keywords don't in the title of your song don't work anymore. We got to move on to doing this other thing, right? So it is a new thing, but I don't know if it'll necessarily change just because the nature of the way platforms work. It's just like people trying to kind of game the system.
Good. Thank you very much, Jeremy. It was an enlightening talk, and we'll let you go to either sleep or whatever is the right mood for you at this moment.
I don't know what to do now. So
thank you everybody for joining. And we are in a month's time, the final seminar in the first series.
Thanks, everyone. I appreciate it.